Matchmaking has always been a contentious topic for Heroes of the Storm. The vast majority of the community agrees something is wrong. So what's happened to the matchmaking system and why was it never fixed? So matchmaking at its core is supposed to queue you in games with people of a similar skill rating, as to avoid one-sided matches and overall improve the experience for everyone involved. So how does it do this then? Well, behind the scenes you are given an MMR, or matchmaking rating. There is a lot that goes into calculating MMR, and in truth a bit of wizardry, but in the main it's significantly affected by your win-losses and the MMR of your team. In addition to this, there is an uncertainty rating and individual performance to factor in, but this is secondary. The system does this for all game modes, so you will have an MMR for Quick Match, ARAM, Storm League, you name it. If we were to look at the standard deviation graphs for Storm League MMR, you can see that the vast majority of players sit within the silver to platinum range, while those at GM and low bronze account for a very small amount. We will come on to how this affects queue times shortly. So at face value, this is great. We should be queued with people of similar skill rating. Well, yes and no. Take Quick Match for example. There are fewer people queuing than there once was, and we know that the game tries to queue you with similar ratings. So what it ends up having to do is look outside of your normal MMR and create a team whose average rating matches the enemy. The result is matching with players that are a few standard deviations apart, so some better players and some worse ones. And since it is very difficult to carry in HOTS opposed to something like League of Legends, this poses a challenge if you are at the top end of your team. There's also this strange phenomenon in free games like HOTS where players will create Smurf accounts, effectively brand new accounts with no MMR as to game the system and play with new players. So the game thinks you're playing someone new, but in reality they aren't. Previously, to combat this, there was a new player matchmaking queue. That meant if you were new to the game, you would only be queued with other new players, but due to issues with a lack of new players and Smurfs, this feature was completely disabled. The result of all of this is that you can get absolutely curb stomped if you try Quick Match for the first time. Imagine that as a new player. Thankfully, the game does have an AI system for players looking to learn the ropes, and I know from reading in the comments that there are plenty of you out there that use this game mode. So what if you're playing with friends then? Well, similar to how it matches you with a team, it first calculates the average MMR between you both, and then searches for a game. So if you are a veteran player who just managed to convince a friend to play with you, then they won't get the typical first game you might want them to. The only real way to circumvent this is to, you guessed it, create a Smurf account, but then you're effectively contributing to the issue I mentioned previously. Look, in my honest opinion, this is never going to go away. Skill-based matchmaking is always going to have its issues when you have churn of new and existing players, which leads me on to my next point, MMR decay. Over time, MMR decreases and the rate at which happens ultimately depends on how high your MMR is. So if you were previously GM, your MMR will decay much faster than say if you were in bronze. This is to account for players who haven't played for a while. You will naturally not be as good as you once were. So if you haven't played for 2 years and expect to be dropped into the same rank, then think again. So I mentioned queue times earlier. How does MMR affect this? Well, if we pull up that graph again for Storm League, we can see that there is a largest amount of players in the middling ranks. So chances are you will be matched faster because there are more people in the queue. On average, it takes around less than 10 minutes for Storm League games. But if you are in GM, for example, with very few players, queue times can be well in excess of an hour. Another reason why players continually make Smurf accounts. Who has time to sit in a queue for this long? On the opposite end of the spectrum is Bronze 5. There is a huge standard deviation between ranks. This is in part to account for new players building MMR and players who are genuinely still learning the game, or indeed MOBAs in general. It does however pose a slight challenge for some players who get stuck in Bronze 5 for a little too long. Storm League has this issue because it forces you to play with similar ranked players, but Quick Match for example allows much greater deviation between players, ultimately improving queue times. Because of all of this, I've noticed some strange cultural behaviour in-game. You'll notice very quickly if your team has the upper hand or not. For example, 1 or 2 players feeding consistently in the first 2 to 3 minutes. I've seen several players complain about this in chat and then instantly leave or go AFK as to shorten the game time. This is particularly prevalent in ARAM. None of what I've mentioned so far factors in your selected role. You see, there are comparatively fewer support and tank players compared to assassins and bruisers. For this reason, queuing up as one of these roles will drastically reduce your queue time, since you are in the minority and the game wants to create a balanced game. Or so we think. I've noticed that the QM matchmaking system isn't afraid of chucking 4 assassins and a healer into a game and calling it quits. The good news for Unranked and Storm League though is that by choosing 2 classes it tries to mitigate this issue, and as for ARAM, this doesn't have a role issue at all, hence why the queue times can be under 10 seconds. So to conclude then, there is definitely a methodology behind matchmaking, and in some cases it can appear broken. This is in part caused by players, but some of it is inherent issues with skill-based matchmaking. Do I think it will ever be fixed? No, because there isn't necessarily an issue with it. Most of the player base has just come to accept the current state of the game. If you like this video, please consider leaving a like or subscribing for more content, and I will see you in the next video.